Impressed on the back of a Magic card, you will find a relic of another era, a sort of amalgamated fossil of graphic design and high fantasy aesthetics. This is the singular piece of imagery that has never been altered in the game's history. The palimpsest of the front side is erased and rewritten every few years, but the card back remains steadfast, a snapshot of a wizard's spellbook through the imagination of 1993 Northwest Washington. At the center of the ovular ring is perhaps the most clever element of Magic game design ever incorporated into the system. These 5 dots are akin to the 8 notes of the musical scale, the 5 vowels and 21 consonants of the modern Latin alphabet. These are the 5 colors of magical energy that guide the game's core philosophy. They are arranged into a perfect pentagon, which is often referred to as a pie or wheel. Like the circle of fifths, each hue has a relationship with one another, but unlike the circle of fifths, every note in the ensemble also has an essence all its own. White and blue and black and red and green are all meticulously defined, in part by connotation and in part by the first few iterations of cards that were crafted near the game's inception. Red, for example, is the color of passion. There is anger and spontaneity in red, alacrity and impatience. The roots of each color's archetypes run very deep. Simply put, the game's success is so thickly interwoven into the idea that each color should do something different than the rest. White should have strengths and weaknesses that black can exploit, but ones that blue should supplement. This is because the arrangement is not arbitrary. Each color has 2 neighbors and 2 opposites. In Magic terms, neighboring colors are called allies, and pairs that stretch across the wheel are considered enemies. Early Magic design understood this concept, but it wasn't until 2005 that ally and enemy colors fully took form and laid a fundamental framework for the game's future. Ravnica, City of Guilds' greatest contribution to research and development were the 10 two-color factions that emerged as the face of the set. In Rosewater's words, Ravnica gave us a new way to look at the color pie, but with 10 pieces instead of 5. The guilds doubled the amount of available design space and effectively revamped the technology that was printed on the card backs 12 years prior. It was like combining harmony to melody. Ravnica has since become the de facto Magic world that cares about factions. A faction, in Magic terms, must possess a creative and mechanical identity. They must be divisible into groups and distinguishable from other factions with different creative and mechanical identities. Dividing by color isn't necessarily the only way to achieve these goals. You can do creature tribes, for example, but it tends to be the most elegant approach when it comes to this game in particular. Just behind Ravnica in the rankings is Tarkir, for example, which divided the color pie into 3 color wedges and utilized all the same tenets found in Ravnica's guilds to construct the 5 clans. Alara also divided the color pie into 3s, but the factions there were divided by worlds instead of groups. All this is to say that this little wheel on the back of the cards was the precipice for one of the most successful IPs that Magic has ever created. As such, I want to look at Ravnica through the lens of colors, both in the theoretical sense that informs game design, as well in the literal sense, as in the hues of the paints that stretch across a canvas. I'm interested in how art direction and mechanics can influence one another, and how both are pressured by long-standing consumer expectations. I want to untangle the weird paradox that is exclusive to Ravnica, which is essentially, how do you distinguish all 10 color pairings from one another, yet at the same time give them a unifying element that grounds them all in one world?
It's notoriously difficult in Magic to do anything new to existing things because you're fighting nostalgia, right? You have to, from the beginning on, tell yourself that you can't beat nostalgia. That's impossible.
That's the voice of Titus Lunter, a renowned illustrator for Magic who was part of the concept push for Guilds of Ravnica.
So what you have to do is you have to come at it from a different angle. You have to be super true to the plane, but you have to not figure out what the plane is exactly, but you have to figure out what the plane means to people, right? So it was more important for me to figure out what Ravnica meant to people and how they experienced the plane rather than the technical details of the plane itself.
The first challenge facing Titus and his team of fellow concept artists was capturing, like a lightning bug, the essence of Ravnica. Contrary to popular belief, it is much more difficult to return to established worlds than to create new ones, in part because of nostalgia, especially if the world you're returning to is much beloved like this one is. Defined as an ecumenopolis, that is, a world made entirely of cityscape, Ravnica's second most distinguishing factor is that buildings and windows and cobblestone streets stretch across the entirety of its land. In narrative designer Alison Lure's words, Ravnica is a Prague-inspired city world governed by 10 different guilds, each overseeing a different aspect of magical urban life, where an ancient magical pact keeps them from engaging in open warfare with each other. Shenanigans ensue. More than its Renaissance European stylings, the guilds are at the epicenter of Ravnica's identity. The city is where these factions can find their highest forms of self-expression, and in a way, their behavior is dictated by such an extreme premise. What I mean is, it only makes sense that the Golgari would inhabit the sewer system and be in charge of recycling all the metropolitan waste into something more useful. Only in a city can the police of the Azorius exercise their rigorous dogmas regarding order and justice, and only in a city could a military fluctuate between civic defense duties and post as armed guard. In some sort of Darwinian sense, the environment produced the shape of the guilds, and as a result, the personalities of the players who championed them. It would be remiss to say that Ravnica's greatest asset to Magic is just how marketable these factions are. Writer Rob Bachman's beautiful critique of the system highlights just how similar Ravnica's Which Guild Are You quiz can feel like subscribing to an astrological sign or sorting yourself into a Harry Potter house. Enneagrams of this nature have us moving away from a nuanced individualism in favor of establishing common ground between players. Again, in Bachman's words, the guilds of Ravnica check off the two human impulses upon which marketing capitalizes: emotional appeal and seeking familiarity. When you choose a guild, you are telegraphing a lot about who you are as a person and a player, but only in an abstract and relative sense. These color pairs can never fully represent their most die-hard members, and there are no doubt some days when each of us feels a little more Orzhov than Simic, or vice versa. But that's the most fun part about this world, and why Magic fans love returning to it. The pre-release for Guilds of Ravnica was the most popular one ever, and of course it was. It's the one world in Magic that meets us more than halfway, the one that always feels a bit more like home than the others. And so Titus Lunter and the team knew they could count on the nostalgia of the city and the familiarity of the guilds to reshape the world. Instead of shying away from such a nostalgia, they fully embraced it as a narrative device. Ravnica is now set in the autumn. The leaves have turned over, the streets are wet with chilly afternoon rain, and the looming signs of winter are beginning to incite paranoia amongst the citizens. Something terrible is coming. The weather is setting us up to sabotage us later.
If you push Ravnica, which is generally associated with really extreme colors, bright red and blue for Izzet, or bright skies and yellow for the plain side. If you start pushing that into a more muted color palette and the darker darks where Innistrad is living, how are you going to tell those two apart? So one of the first things that we had to do, or which I had a lot of fun working on, is trying to figure out how do you separate the planes in terms of art, like foreground, midground, background, sky to ground relationships. If you simplify an image to its most absolute basic and you're only allowed to use 3 colors and 3 shapes, what is that going to be for Ravnica? All right, there's going to be gray in the sky because autumn and rain. Okay, so that we know. What are the buildings then going to be? All right, so we need to have this feeling of oppression. So that means that from that art point of view, the color relationship and the value relationship between the sky and the buildings have to be pretty close. If you make too big of a contrast between those two, they will start to feel disconnected. We push the buildings to be slightly darker because then they feel like they're looming over you. I started treating the sky as, a friend. It was raining, but it's sort of a warmer kind of gray. It's not a summer kind of warm, but it's not a winter kind of cool gray either. So we're right in that middle, and we enjoy that rain. What we don't enjoy is the oppressiveness of the buildings and the bureaucracy. So we push the buildings slightly more into the cool range. That's why a lot of the rooftops are changed from red to blue.
Ravnica is in Cold War. The guilds are used to conflict like this, but the creative team wanted to pass that feeling from the denizens onto us. This is why Citywide Bust is breaking the fourth wall, both in art and in flavor text. Isolate from M19 and Conclave Tribunal also want us to identify with the oppressed. Creeping Chill does something similar. We can sense that danger is just around the corner. The shadows are indicative of the immediate threat, but the leaves on the ground and the worried face beneath the hood show signs of something worse. Magic players are used to the dramatic setup that the introductory set brings, but the stakes are a bit higher now because that sense of home is being threatened by some outside force. To place Ravnica in autumn accomplishes 2 main goals. It invites artists to switch out palettes and reimagine a world with an already established visual identity. It also extends beyond the cards and parallels the changes that many folks in the Northern Hemisphere are already witnessing in their daily life. To do this connects players to the game in the same way that other entertainment media do. We tend to watch horror flicks in October and cozy up to the Christmas classics as we close out the year. Given that we've visited Ravnica twice already, and both times happened in the fall, the game is now linking the present to the past. If you played during Return to Ravnica, or as early as the debut block, you may begin to compare just how much in your life has changed since then. In effect, Magic can cultivate its own flavor of nostalgia by returning to very familiar planes at similar times. On a personal note, I have been appreciating the changing of the seasons on this plane. Poring over the 5 guilds presented thus far, it is delightful to see the ways in which autumn is expressed according to the parameters set for each color pairing. We can live a full day in the life wandering about the city gates, observing just how the season reveals its colors to us. The Boros are depicted at the golden hour, when the glow of a rising or setting sun makes everyone look their best. It's the time of day for immediacy, a perfect sensation for the guilds that cares about fast action. The Boros are red and white, so pinks and oranges complement their armor and embellishments. They are shiny and possess an aura of righteousness to them, and the sun is central to their image.
So for the Boros, there was actually a slight shift in materials where the buildings now have slightly more metal ornamentation on it. So that's what we decided to move into. Even though the Boros is super defined, from a concept point of view, there was not a whole lot done for the Boros buildings. We know the geometrical shapes, but is the ornamentation slightly different? Yes, because they kind of get a harder edge to it.
Visually speaking, there is very little magic represented in Boros. Instead, they show off their weapons and gear. They are soldiers and knights, not wizards, and are depicted very heavily at street level, as if the weight of these materials kept them there. The Selesnya are the other guilds who wander about Ravnica during the day. The only difference is the sun is high in the sky. It is bright and shining and full of hope, and the Selesnya embody the pure expression of the natural world in the city. Sid's work on camaraderie is the quintessential image of Selesnya. Look how the light pulls the facial expressions out of the central figures. The light blue atmospheric background complements the rich greens, and the white costuming and fur keeps the piece balanced. Moss and stones and trees show up the most in this guild, both in the framing of the figures and dressed on the creatures themselves. Orange shows up in Selesnya as well, which brings a vibrancy to the palette. Given that green and orange are 2/3 of a triad on the color wheel, the leaves in cards like Centaur Peacemaker and Conclave Cavalier read extremely sharp against their surroundings. American audiences associate such tones to Thanksgiving, to cornucopias and celebrations of harvest. The Selesnya cultivate warmth in the face of dropping temperatures. An outlier in this guild is a card like Rosemane Centaur by Niels Hamm. His autumnal tones tap into the melancholy that a cool breeze brings in, which fit well with the setup that something wicked this way comes.
My name is Ryan Pankos. I'm a freelance illustrator. I work mostly for Magic, but I paint traditionally using mostly oils, and I've been doing that for about 10 years.
Night of Autumn is another standout illustration from this set, and I wanted to dig a little deeper into Ryan's process for this piece.
When choosing colors, I kind of try to choose like a key color to kind of base the whole painting off of. So I knew that the autumnal colors were super important. So basically, knowing that, I went full volume on her hair. So her hair is bright orange. And then kind of based everything off of that. Like I knew I wanted to have kind of like a sunburst behind her back, as if the rains had parted, the sun was kind of peeking out and is kind of creating this mist over the entire scene. I still wanted to include like the full gamut of colors. I didn't want it to be all blown out by sunlight.
Ryan also called back to one of his previous pieces in Dryad Militant to inform the soldier behind the knight. The horses here are made of branches and twigs, and again, that orange gives an ethereal quality to the piece. It pushes the group of sentries onward, as if mobilizing them for battle. It was important for Ryan to get that exact tone correct as to not blow out the entirety of the palette as a result.
So I took the orange of her hair and kind of looked at it and said, okay, well, how blue do I need to make the background to make it look blue? And it turns out I don't need to make it that blue to make it appear blue on the piece. So I'm always making the judgment calls. Like I'm always choosing one color and kind of keying everything else off of that. So I'm not ending up with a complete blue next to a complete orange. I'm kind of tempering everything based on that one singular color.
The other 3 guilds on Ravnica don't come out during the day. The Izzet appear only during thunderstorms, which they are manufacturing. Their skies echo those of Titus Lunter's earlier comments, a warm gray full of turmoil. The city of Ravnica through the lens of the Izzet feels polluted and neon, like a Times Square on New Year's Eve or a Los Angeles in Blade Runner. Saturated pinks bounce off of electric blues and make these cards buzz. The Izzet are explosive, and a particle-filled air allows artists to fill the entirety of the frame with frenetic energies. Just beneath the mayhem above lurk the Golgari swarm. They are the discarded, the kings and queens of rot. A synthetic, almost chemical green appears in a few of their cards. The mushrooms that grow from the city waste are radiating. The Golgari are the abominations, the rejects, the gritty kids who grew up playing baseball after dark in alleyways and overgrown parking lots. If autumn is a horror film, then we've found our monster. When the beasts from the underworld go above ground to play, they take over entirely. The moon comes out to show off the Gorgon's hair, but everything glows with a slight tinge of aquamarine. The Golgari are the ignored, and so in their clothing and their posing, they make their statement. Ravnica is changing, and the 5th guild of this set received perhaps their biggest mechanical and visual makeover of the bunch. Previously known as the guild that didn't exist, the Dimir have been revamped. They are visible, but only to us, the spectator. In Mike Linneman's Meditations, the Dimir are a fantasy film noir. They are repeatedly depicted right before they commit their crimes, be them assassinations or treacheries. They lurk at night, under the yellows of the full moon. A deep violet highlights their leathery cloaks and flowing capes. In autumn, the sun starts to set earlier and earlier. We spend more time inside. We become a bit more introverted and self-reflexive. We take off the masks we must wear at our day jobs and replace them with the characters we see in ourselves. The Dimir is dressing up for a night out on the town, with that devilish energy that comes along the edge of the first cocktail. They are the Night Watch, the keepers of secrets. And so the 5 guilds are fragmented like the colors on a pentagon. They exist in a surreal world, a city divided cleanly into 10 neat factions. In Italy, twice a year, the citizens of Siena champion a banner that corresponds to the neighborhood in which they live. They produce a horse and a rider to race around a cobblestone piazza that often leads to a broken leg or a bruised jockey. The winner of the race becomes the champion of their neighborhood, and thus the champion of Siena. The horse is celebrated in the cathedral. It is a big to-do. Ravnica's poignancy is found in how increasingly close to home it grows with each of its iterations. We are not so estranged from the fantasy world that embodies the tension of political strife, rivalrous feuds, issues with waste management, and all the other troubles that accompany living in an urban center. To return to my main questions, what distinguishes the guilds yet keeps them unified as part of a whole? It is ultimately the nature of the city itself. Just as we cannot experience all of Ravnica at once, but instead are forced to imagine it through a series of still shots, inconsistent angles, glimpses of distant spires and municipalities, but never firmly via a map or a 3-dimensional digital tour, we also cannot experience our own cities as a whole. We instead live within them, a citizen amongst a bustling and confusing and unnerving pile of metal and noise. On some days, we prioritize the values of justice, of order, of law, and of nature. We go out at night to concerts and cafes and synchronize with the rhythm of the dancers around us. We sit in city parks and watch the sunset while eating grapes or throwing a frisbee. We pet dogs and feed bodega cats. The city looks different every time we visit it. Over time, we feel the temperature drop and angst creep in. We look to our past selves for guidance. In the haze of the unanswerable questions, we resort to color wheels and card games to ground us. I am red and blue today. In Calvino's words, cities, like dreams, are made of desires and fears, even if the thread of their discourse is secret. Their rules are absurd, their perspectives deceitful, and everything conceals something else.